So you've made your sourdough starter and you've made lots and lots of bread. You've even used your starter discard to make cookies or banana bread. But you know what we haven't made? Pizza. So before we actually get to cooking the pizza, we need to talk about dough. So if you've already been making sourdough bread, this process is going to feel very familiar, but it might actually be a little bit simpler. So for the flour, I like to use a 00 pizza flour, mainly because pizza flour is a nice strong flour, around 11 to 12% protein, but it's super finely milled, which means it makes a really nice textured pizza, kind of what you're looking for, that nice soft but crisp texture. If you can't get pizza flour, you can of course make this with either bread flour or plain flour, or my preference if I can't get hold of the pizza flour is just an equal mix of the two. So apart from the flour, we're also going to need water, olive oil, salt, and of course our risen levan or our starter. So in this recipe I call for making a levan, and that's simply because normally when I come to make this recipe in the morning, my starter has already started to fall, which means it's past its peak period for baking with. Now, if you happen to have this on a schedule where you want to start the dough and it's at its peak, then of course you can just use this instead, because in my recipes I always use 100% hydration levan and 100% hydration starter, so they're basically interchangeable. To make the levan, mix together 25 grams of our starter, 25 mils of water at 28 degrees, and mix just a little bit to break up. To that, add 25 grams of bread flour and mix that until smooth. Mark the position on the jar where the levan started, and then cover and pop into a warm spot for about 2 hours or until doubled in size. Now, unlike my sourdough bread recipe, this is really easy. It's a one-step process, basically. All we're going to do is add everything into our bowl. First the water and the levan, just mixing that together just to dissolve the levan a little bit. So this is a 65% hydration dough. So I'm going to use 325 mils of water, and this water is at 30 degrees Celsius. To that we're going to add our levan, which is 100 grams. This is a white levan, but you could use one that is a mix of white and wholemeal. You could use any style of starter for this, really. And then I'm just gonna mix this around just to get this broken up a little bit. Then we're gonna add the rest of the ingredients and just bring that together as a kind of rough dough. You don't need to do this with any kneading, you don't need to do this in a machine, you can just do this completely by hand. You're looking to make sure there's no dry pockets of flour, make sure that everything is hydrated, but we don't need to knead this at this stage. Okay, so when it feels like there's no more dry pockets, just scrape off the excess dough from your fingers, scrape down the sides of the bowl so there's no dry bits, and then we can set that aside for 30 minutes to hydrate and to rest. Now, as this is the start of our bulk fermentation, because the starter is in there, I'm going to still put this in a nice warm spot around 26 degrees. So after 30 minutes, our dough has relaxed and we can knead it. Now, unlike with our sourdough loaves, we're going to build in that strength right at the start. We're not going to do loads of stretch and folds, although you can. What I'm going to do instead is do a knead now for a few minutes, about 5 minutes, and then I'm just going to do 2 sets of stretch and folds. And mainly that's to get the strength nice and strong to start with, but it's also to make it a little bit more hands-off, so we're not having to look after the dough for hours on end, and we can just leave it to do its thing. So there's a few kneading methods you can do. One of them is just in the bowl, and you can kind of do this slapping motion where you kind of go underneath and you cup the dough against the side of the bowl. You can do a slap and fold. You can knead it traditionally by hand. You can put it in the mixer for 5 minutes or so. I'm gonna do the slap and fold because it's my favorite method for mixing a dough like this. So to do the slap and fold method, we're just gonna scrape the dough out of the bowl onto our work surface. And basically you're gonna put your fingertips underneath the dough, lift it, slap it down, fold it over. And we're just going to keep doing that for about 5 minutes. You want to turn the dough every time you pick it up. And you're just going to do this for about 5 minutes to build in a nice large amount of strength to our dough. As you do it, you should feel the dough, it'll tighten up initially, and then you'll feel it become really nice and elastic and a little bit more stretchy. So basically you're letting it fall, you're pulling backwards, turning it over, pull over, pull over, like that. And once you've got the hang of it, you'll find a really nice rhythm, and you can do this for a good few minutes. Every now and again, just bring those scraps into the middle, and then just keep going. It's probably hard for you to tell, but I can feel this dough is already becoming more elastic, more stretchy, and that is a very good thing. If you're going to stretch this traditionally, just kind of pushing it like that, resist adding any flour. But if you find it's really difficult to work with, you could very lightly oil the work surface. So after about 8 minutes or so of kneading, 8 to 10 minutes with the slap and fold, or about 5 minutes in a stand mixer, you'll find the dough is really nice and smooth. It's got a nice elasticity to it, and when we form it into a ball, it's nice and springy. Now at this stage, I'm going to put it in a very lightly oiled bowl, just a little bit so the dough doesn't stick. And normally I like to put the dough seam side up first, then flip it so that both sides of the dough are covered in a very thin amount of oil. So at this stage, the dough is going to bulk ferment, so I'm going to pop it in the oven as usual with the light set on, just to keep it nice and warm. We want to keep that temperature roughly around 26 degrees. After 30 minutes, we're going to do the first set of stretch and folds. You'll be able to tell that the dough doesn't have a huge amount of resistance right now. You can stretch it fairly easily. So do our 4 sets and then cover and set aside for 30 minutes. On the second set, you should feel that there is a lot more resistance, and after even just the first turn, you'll feel it tighten up. And that's a great sign we've built in enough strength to our dough. So it's been about 3 to 4 hours. The dough has risen a little bit, not loads. You can see that it has some really nice fermentation signs on there. It's got a bubbled surface, just domed a little bit. It's looking great. So all we need to do is take our dough and just very carefully, you don't want to deflate it too much, or just tease it out of the bowl, like that. Then we're going to divide it into 4 pieces. Now, you can weigh this if you want. I tend to just give it a couple of folds to form it into a nice round ball. And we're going to cut it into 4. Because the dough has a little bit of oil on, it's also incredibly easy to work with. So just take the edges, fold it into the middle. All we're trying to do is create a nice, tight, formed ball that when we turn it over, has a nice, tight skin. So once we've formed it roughly, I'm just going to use my hands. I'm just kind of rolling around the surface. I'm not putting a lot of pressure. I'm basically just helping the skin on the bottom to tighten up. So when you've got a nice, tight, bouncy little ball, we can set that aside and just finish the other ones. So at this stage, we have to decide whether we're going to use the pizza tomorrow or freeze it and use it at a later date. Because this makes 4, I'm going to go do half and half. So for the frozen ones, I'm going to take little plastic containers like this. I'm just going to add a little bit of olive oil, just swoosh that around a little bit, get the pot nice and oiled up, and then we're going to carefully transfer our dough seam side up to the container. Sometimes I just turn it around in the oil just to make sure everything's coated. Then we can pop the lid on. And then if we decide we're going to use these pizzas tomorrow, I'm going to take a 9x13 tray, a brownie tray or a cake pan, It's useful if it's got high sides because then the dough doesn't get caught on any cling film. And we're just going to dust it with a thin layer of flour. And then we're going to take our dough balls and just very carefully transfer those to the tin. And then both of these doughs, whether they're going to be frozen for use later or we're going to use them tomorrow, these need to be bulk fermented for about another 4 hours before either putting in the freezer for another day or putting in the fridge for between 12 to 24 hours before using. So it's been about 4 hours. I've had my government allowed walk for the day. I've got dinner cooking, and whilst the dough has been sitting, it has proved really nicely. The dough in the tubs has noticeably grown. It's much easier to judge when it's in tubs like this. The dough that we're going to use tomorrow has got really nice signs of fermentation on the skin, lots of nice little bubbles. So we're now going to do two separate things with this. The dough we're going to use tomorrow is going to go in the fridge for anywhere between 12 and 24 hours. You can leave it longer if you want, but I find it starts to get a little bit harder to work with after that 24-hour period. Dough that's going to be frozen, I'm just going to put it straight in the freezer. Mark on there when you made it, because I don't find this dough lasts really long. It's not like other things you can freeze. I find it's best after a couple of weeks. After that, you may find it may not come back to life when you defrost it. We'll talk about how to use this later, but for now, we're going to get these into their little cold environments. So I know that pizza dough has taken the best part of a whole day, but remember, most of that time was hands off. We haven't really done much active work. We've mainly just been waiting for the sourdough to do its thing. And there is just nothing better than a really good homemade pizza. And trust me, tomorrow when you make your pizza, this will all have been worth it, I promise. Okay, so our dough has been in the fridge for about 14 hours at this point. It's relaxed, it's looking great, but it's not quite ready to use. If we try and make pizzas with this now, it won't stretch very easily, it'll just be a bit difficult to handle. So what we're gonna do is let it come to room temperature for about 4 hours, and then it will make it so much easier to handle, and we can make the most amazing pizza. So for the frozen dough, what I tend to do is, obviously, when it comes out of the freezer, it's rock solid, so we can't just leave it for that 4 to 5 hours before using. So what I tend to do is I take it out the day before I want to use it, throw it in the fridge and leave it there anywhere between 12 to 24 hours, A, to defrost, but B, to help it develop more flavor, like our regular dough would do as it sits there in the fridge before we use it. After it's sat there for that 12 to 24 hours, you can just proceed as normal. So you're going to take it out 4 to 5 hours before you want to use it and let it come to room temperature. And by the time you've finished using it, it should be around 25, 26 degrees, and that is the perfect temperature to use this dough. So for our sauce, we're going to keep things really classic, and we're going to basically do an uncooked tomato sauce. So all you're going to do is take a tin of San Marzano tomatoes. If you can't get hold of that variety, plum tomatoes will be fine. And all we're going to do is crush these. Now, if you want, you can do it classic with your hands and just squish all of those tomatoes until they break down. But I like to puree it just with a stick blender just to break it up so it's a little bit finer. Now, sometimes you'll see people strain this to reduce the liquid content, and that's normally because the pizzas cook so fast. However, because we're doing it in a home oven and we're going to cook it in 2 different ways, it cooks for a little bit longer. So I find just leaving the tomatoes as they are creates the perfect topping. Now, in terms of flavoring, you can leave it as it is just with a little pinch of salt, but I'm going to add a little chili flake and a little bit crushed garlic just to add a little bit of extra background flavor. Now, when it comes to the cheese, we have a little bit of a problem. And that's because when you use fresh mozzarella, a ball mozzarella, it releases a lot of liquid. Now, you can do that in a really hot pizza oven because it helps to evaporate off a lot of that liquid. And so you don't get too much of that soupy base. But I find when you make it at home, the temperatures in the ovens just don't get hot enough to cook off that liquid. And you just get this layer of water on top of the pizza, and it's not great. So in America, you can find low moisture mozzarella, much easier. Here, it's almost impossible until I found this stuff. This stuff is much drier than a fresh mozzarella, like a ball mozzarella, and it releases a lot less liquid. So it is perfect for making pizzas at home. The one thing I will talk about later is when to add it to the pizza. If you add it too early, it will release some liquid. If you add it just at the right moment, you get perfect cheese on the most delicious pizza. Okay, so now that we're ready to actually make pizza, we're gonna do it in a slightly unusual way, but it's a really great way to make pizza at home. We're gonna use the frying pan method. So what you need is some sort of heavy bottom frying pan. So a cast iron like this is great, or a cast iron like this is great. You want something that's around 9 to 10 inches because that's what size pizza this recipe will make, but either of these sizes will work. And the key to this is getting everything really, really hot. Most domestic ovens only go up to say 250 degrees, whereas we can get a cast iron pot or a heavy bottom frying pan up to about 300 degrees. So it gives us a little bit of extra heat to play with. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna get this going, get this hot whilst we work on our dough. So we're gonna take our dough and just carefully take it out of a tub, and we're going to just quite a bit of flour on it. We want to make this easy to work with, and this dough is nice and soft. So to form the dough, just push in the middle, leaving the outer edge. This is just going to help us form our crust. And as you can see, the crust is super puffy, full of air, and we don't want to knock that out. So just turn that over, do the same, just to push it out a little bit further, and that's when we need to start stretching. So the way I like to start is I just lift it up and turn it with the crust over my fingertips so we don't smoosh it down too much. And then just let gravity do its work. You can tease it with your hands, kind of stretch it that way. My favorite method is just resting it on my knuckles, just turning it. Again, letting gravity doing it. Using your knuckles because it's nice and delicate. And you're trying to get this to a 9 or 10 inch round. So every now and again, just give it a little check. About 8 inches. We're just trying to be delicate enough that we don't tear it, but letting it stretch out naturally. So we'll just test the temperature of our frying pan. We are at 295, so it's a great temperature to start. So all we're going to do, very carefully, we're going to drape the pizza dough very carefully into the pan. And then whilst it starts to cook on the base, we're going to add our sauce. And just spread that around gently, just up to the edges. Now, what I talked about earlier in terms of adding the cheese at the right time, we don't want to add it at this stage. I'm going to add it just before it goes under our smoking hot grill, and that's so it doesn't get too hot. So you can see the crust is bubbling up really nicely, and if you just take a little sneak peek underneath, we've got nice browning. So what I'm going to do now is add my cheese, and then I'm going to go real simple on this. I'm just going to add some oregano, and then the pizza's going to go underneath the grill for about 2 to 3 minutes. And we're just looking for the crust to get some nice browning and our cheese to have melted. So you can see it has really nice bubbling on the crust. Not too much liquid from the cheese. It's a great looking pizza. I cannot tell you how good this homemade pizza is. It's better than anything you could think you could make in a home oven without any fancy equipment, no wood-fired oven, just a regular home oven and a frying pan. It's so simple, and the pizzas you will turn up will be so good. As always, the recipe is up in the corner or down in the description box below. If you're new around here, I make new baking videos every single week, so make sure you're subscribed and click that notification bell to find out when my next video goes live. I'll be back next week with a brand new video and recipe, so I'll see you next week, and I hope you enjoy making your pizzas this weekend.